History. This is Mr. G, your instructor. This is supposed to be a mandatory attendance, and I see there's nobody here. So I'm going to go ahead and give the lecture, and then I'm going to have a little surprise for you a little bit later on. I thought I would first start putting this together and give you a little intro as to what World War II was all about.
In the words of Winston Churchill, in the Second World War, every bond between man and man was to perish. Crimes were committed by the Germans under the Hitlerite domination to which they allowed themselves to be subjected, which find no equal in scale and wickedness with any that have darkened the human record. The wholesale massacre by systematized processes of 6 or 7 millions of men, women and children in the German execution camps exceeds in horror the rough and ready butcheries of Genghis Khan, and in scale reduces them to pygmy proportions. Deliberate extermination of whole populations was contemplated and pursued by both Germany and Russia in the Eastern War. The hideous process of bombarding open cities from the air, once started by the Germans, was repaid 20-fold by the ever-mounting power of the Allies, and found its culmination in the use of the atomic bombs which obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay, so World War II was about the threats to the balance of power, and there was a conflict among nations, peoples, and ideas. There were new methods of warfare, and of course you saw that part in there about the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. It was a war of absolutes and the values of Western civilization. Now, when we look at the causes, we went into the causes about the Treaty of Versailles, and there were also things involved with the limitations, how Adolf Hitler had blamed the November criminals for losing the war, stabbing Germany in the back. So, it created more problems than it solved. The Eastern European satellite states, there was an Allied naval blockade of Germany. And the Germans had to admit to war guilt. Now, the League of Nations was an alliance of victors against the vanquished.
It was a simple and noble policy to keep Germany disarmed after the struggle of the First World War, and the victors sufficiently armed in vigilance. But errors were soon made. America's failure to enter the League of Nations, the weakness and lack of resolution of Western democracies to confront the growing strength of the fascist dictators in Germany, Italy and Japan, and the economic turmoil that allowed these events to spark and build. Upon reflection, it is all too easy to see and understand how this tragedy could have been avoided, but for those in power at the time, they failed all too well to see the gathering storm that confronted them. The origins of the Second World War can be found within the confines of the Palace of Versailles. Germany's surrender in the First World War was a shock to both the international community as well as to its people. Militarily, Germany had been successful on the Eastern Front. Troops were deep within France, and Germany itself was untouched. However, on November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a ceasefire came into effect. An armistice had been signed, and the war to end all wars had come to an end. The proud peoples of Germany had been defeated. The Allies, victorious after 4 years of suffering and untold casualties, wanted to see Germany pay. To ensure something like this would never happen again, an international institution was to be established, in the hope of bringing about a new world of collective security, later seen in the form of the League of Nations. In early 1919, the Germans were summoned to Versailles, not to negotiate, but rather to hear the terms they would have to implement and endure. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Woodrow Wilson of America, George Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy all attended with the aim of weakening Germany. World War I had radically altered the political European map, with the defeat of the Central Powers including Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. The German state that came out of the Great War was also to experience profound change and suffer severe territorial losses. Germany was to lose a portion of its eastern land, creating a new Polish state and establishing a Polish corridor between Germany and East Prussia, giving Poland access to the sea. The port city of Danzig, the largest city on the coast, was given to the League of Nations. Mabel in the Baltic was handed over to Lithuania. Alsace-Lorraine to France, and the mineral-rich Saarland was to be administered by the League of Nations for a span of 15 years, with the Rhineland becoming a demilitarized zone, providing France with additional security. The German colonies in Africa were distributed to the British and the French, and their South Pacific colonies would be given to Japan. In addition, military clauses were added to the treaty. The German army could be no larger than 100,000 troops, they were allowed no air force, no tanks or heavy artillery, and the German navy could have no more than 6 warships, with no U-boats or submarines. Insult being added to injury, a war guilt clause was placed in the treaty, making Germany accept full responsibility for the outbreak of the war, as it was only on this basis that the Allies could demand reparations. France and Britain had begun the war as creditor states, but had ended as debtor nations and wanted to be repaid. The sums being asked of Germany in reparations were many times more than was possible for them to pay, placing a severe burden on their economy, which later contributed greatly to economic instability and hyperinflation. John Maynard Keynes, the primary representative of the British Treasury at the time, said, "I believe that the campaign for securing out of Germany the general costs of the war was one of the most serious acts of political unwisdom for which our statesmen have ever been responsible. The German people believed they had been bitterly betrayed by their high command and unjustly treated by the international system, views that would later materialise throughout the 1920s and 30s. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the preceding Great Depression, the world was plunged into economic turmoil and Germany was hit hard. American banks withdrew the loans they had made to Germany and the economy collapsed overnight. Due to such large reductions in cash and capital, banks struggled to provide money and credit, and so in 1931 there were runs on German and Austrian banks, with several of them closing. Businesses closed at an alarming rate, and by 1933 unemployment had reached 6 million. Many people were left homeless and thousands of children died from malnutrition. A lack of government resolve, and out of despair, many turned to alternative political leaders and parties in the hope their problems would be solved. One man in particular garnered a lot of attention from his rousing speeches, and this man was Adolf Hitler. Hitler's speeches delivered clear culprits for Germany's problems. The November criminals who had signed the armistice ending World War I, the liberals and socialists who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, the communists who threatened revolution in Germany, and finally the Jewish bankers who plotted to undermine and destroy the German state. The Nazi and Communist parties both clashed violently, and Hitler claimed to be the only one to bring about order and end the Red Plague. As a powerful and gifted public speaker, Hitler was able to capitalise on public discontent. His party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, grew to record levels. In September of 1930, the Nazi Party had increased its representation in the Reichstag, the German parliament, almost tenfold, winning 107 seats, and only 2 years later in 1932, they won 230 seats, becoming the majority in parliament. Hitler had found the failures and misery of the Great Depression to his advantage, stating for hard reality has opened the eyes of millions of Germans. In the 1932 election, Hitler also ran for president, and although he lost to decorated war hero Paul von Hindenburg, his rising popularity gave President Hindenburg no choice but to appoint Hitler on the 30th of January 1933 as Chancellor of Germany, head of the German government. Just 1 month after Hitler had been sworn in as Chancellor, a fire was started in the Reichstag by a young Dutch communist who was then used to paint all communists as the enemy of Germany. Using Article 48 of the Constitution, the Reichstag fire decree was passed that abolished civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Shortly after, Hitler created a secret police known as the Gestapo, helping him to suppress any and all opposition. As Chancellor, he also tripled the size of the German military, violating the Treaty of Versailles, banned all rival parties, killed political opponents, and prohibited Jews from working, voting, and occupying public spaces. After the death of President von Hindenburg in 1934, Hitler declared himself Führer of Germany, absolute dictator. Hitler believed the world to come would be dominated by 4 main superpowers. Germany was to be the main hegemonic power of mainland Europe, the British maintaining their international empire, The Japanese, or the Aryans of the East as Hitler liked to call them, would be the main power in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and finally America would dominate the Western Hemisphere. Part of Nazi support was their opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, and upon coming to power, Hitler promised to return Germany to its rightful place in the world. Hitler's objectives were clear. The economy needed to be self-sufficient, and what the Germans called economic autarky, being able to produce their own goods and not relying too heavily on imports. This was critical to withstand a British blockade to trade, a policy that had damaged Germany in the First World War. Germany would also need Lebensraum, or living space, that would facilitate the growing German population. Lebensraum was to be found in the east, and this meant Germany would have to expand into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and agricultural regions of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this new German Reich that was to be created was to be racially pure, containing only the Aryan race, free of Slavs and Jews of whom would have to leave or be eliminated. And it was also Germany's mission to launch a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, an ideology and enemy that home took the form of the Soviet Union. A war he thought would inevitably have to happen.
Okay, so what was wrong with the Treaty of Versailles? That didn't guarantee any peace and security. There were no binding standards created for peace and security, and how would you guarantee peace if you don't have a military force to back up the resolutions? In 1928, there was a Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war as an international crime. The League of Nations never was a league of all nations. The United States was not involved in it. The United States Congress would not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Germany and the Soviet Union were excluded, and the United States, like I said, had never joined. Economic conditions in Germany, there were reparations and a very slow recovery. The Great Depression intensified economic nationalism, and governments imposed high tariffs to preserve home markets. Now, what is a high tariff? That's a tax on stuff coming into your country. And so, people didn't want to do business if they got to pay high taxes to do it. Depression was the last blow to Weimar Germany. That was the government set up in Weimar Germany they called it the Weimar Republic, and it failed. The power passed to the Nazis in 1933, and Germany under Adolf Hitler basically ignored the provisions of Versailles. There was a decline in Japanese exports, played into the hands of the Japanese military. In 1931, the Japanese invaded a Chinese province called Manchuria, and they later named it Manchukuo, and they had just committed all kinds of atrocities against the Chinese people. Of course, then again, the invasion that they had in 1937 would be worse. It was called Nanking. And there would be a lot of atrocities that were committed, and after the war, nobody was tried for those crimes. They're considered war crimes. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and the ideologies were of violent nationalism, glorifying the nation, and national destiny. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany formed the Axis, later joined by Japan. Fascist regimes started to pop up in Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Romania. The special case was Czechoslovakia. Okay. An atmosphere of fear and apprehension throughout the world, as far as this was concerned. Aggression as a challenge to civilization. Avoiding another war. The 1930s were considered a low, dishonest decade. W.H. Auden wrote in 1939. Appeasement. Assumptions. The outbreak of another world war was unthinkable. British and American arguments that Germany had been mistreated at Versailles. Fascist states were a bulwark against Soviet communism. So it doesn't matter how many people you kill, and you're in a dictatorship, as long as they save you from communism, that's the best thing. Ends. How to maintain Europe's balance of power. Soviets were the greater threat, and so accommodate Hitler. The League of Nations, the Japanese invasion of China, turned into an invasion of the whole country in 1937, which is known as the Rape of Nanking. Kill all, burn all, and destroy all, 1937. Because of these invasions that Japan was having, where they wanted to spread what they call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, where they're going to bring all the Asians into the Japanese Empire, the United States decided to step up embargoes on Japan, and this is what led to another event that took place later on that we're going to get to. The League expressed shock but did nothing. In fact, the Japanese left the League of Nations in 1933 because there was nothing the League of Nations could do. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, avenging the defeat of 1896. Of course, there's nothing in Ethiopia but sand. The League imposed sanctions on Italy but without enforcement. The Spanish Civil War began as a weak Republican government could not overcome opposition, and there was an extreme right-wing military officers rebelled. They were led by Generalissimo Francisco Franco. And this is a map of what occurred during the Spanish Civil War. You could probably read more about it in your book if you're reading your book. Hitler and Mussolini sent in troops and tested new weapons in the Spanish Civil War. The war was a dress rehearsal for World War II. The Soviets sided with the communist troops fighting for the Spanish Republic. Britain and France failed to act decisively. Volunteers from England, France, and the United States went to fight, saw the war as a test of the West's determination to resist fascism. Blum and the Popular Front was limited support, and they feared intervention would polarize France. In April 1937 was the destruction of Guernica. Hitler's lessons from this were Britain, France, and the Soviet Union would have a hard time containing fascism, which they did. Britain and France would do anything to avoid war. German armament and the politics of appeasement. What is appeasement? Appeasement is you keep giving the enemy what they want and they keep taking more. It doesn't work. Hitler played on Germans' sense of shame and betrayal and removed Germany from the League of Nations in 1933. Well, that was inevitable. He tore up disarmament provisions of Versailles in 1935, the unification of all ethnic Germans, where he came up with this phrase called Lebensraum. And Lebensraum was living space. He needed living space. If you'll excuse me for 1 second, please. So the unification of all ethnic Germans through Lebensraum, anybody that spoke German or was a part of Germany, like Austria, because Adolf Hitler was not German, he was Austrian. He was born on Braunau am Inn, which is Braunau on the Inn River in 1889. He reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, and France and Britain did nothing. Well, the Rhineland is merely part of the Rhineland's like right in here, and it was occupied by Allied troops after World War One, before Germany had paid their reparations. So when he did that, it was basically just going in his own backyard. But Britain did nothing and would do nothing because they had a leader who had no backbone. His name was Neville Chamberlain. Okay. In 1938, there was the annexation of Austria, which was no response from the West, and that is known as the Anschluss. Hitler declared his intention to occupy the Sudetenland, which was Czechoslovakia. And then finally, Neville Chamberlain decides he wants to step in. So he wants to get all these types of agreements from Hitler, get him to sign agreements. And it really doesn't matter because Hitler's going to break them anyway.
The international system that had been envisaged was not able to cope. Without the support of the British and the United States' absence following a policy of non-interventionism, France was left alone to maintain and enforce the Treaty of Versailles, something it couldn't and didn't want to do alone. Held in Geneva, Switzerland, the Disarmament Conference provided a preview for how Hitler operated and what future Nazi policy would look like. Hitler instructed his representatives at the conference to state that Germany would completely disarm, if, and only if, France, Britain, Japan and the United States would do the same. This was an offer that Hitler correctly assumed would be denied. And so he went back to the German people and showed them how this conference was not about disarmament, but rather keeping Germany subjugated. And so in 1933, Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference to the support of his people. In 1934, to the surprise of the international community, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with Poland, taking an ally away from France and weakening France's military positioning, as Germany was now free to the east. In March of 1935, Germany revealed it had been building an air force, the Luftwaffe, again breaking the Treaty of Versailles, with the justification being that Britain, France and Poland all had an air force and that Germany too needed to defend itself. 1 week later, Hitler declared his intentions to introduce conscription, to build an army of 500,000 men. Once again, the League of Nations protested, but no action was taken. The disarmament clauses outlined in the Treaty of Versailles had been destroyed. Then, in June of 1935, to France's horror, Britain had entered into a naval agreement with Germany. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement, in which Britain recognised Germany's right to build up its navy. They were to be allowed up to 35% of Britain's surface tonnage and a submarine fleet up to 60% that of Britain's. Britain had struck a deal, and in doing so had given up on Versailles, given up on disarmament, and began to show Hitler that a policy of appeasement was to be pursued. A year later, in March 1936, German troops were sent into the demilitarised Rhineland. The matter was referred to the League of Nations, which once again did nothing. Remilitarisation of the Rhine was the final nail in the coffin for the Treaty of Versailles and the international order. The treaty was now officially dead. France, in response to German occupation of the Rhine, constructed a Maginot Line along its eastern border. However, the fortification stopped at the Ardennes forest and did not extend across the Belgian frontier, the place at which Germany had entered during the Great War. The French were preparing for a war of the trenches and were not prepared for the motorised divisions that made German blitzkrieg tactics so effective. Stalin at this time, threatened by German power and aggression, entered the Soviet Union into the League of Nations and also signed an agreement with Czechoslovakia, stating he would come to their aid if attacked, but only if the Western Allies would come to its defence first. This was to stop the West trying to push German aggression eastwards. Hitler wanted all German-speaking nations in Europe to be unified, especially his native homeland Austria. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany and Austria were forbidden to be unified, as the Allies hadn't fought 4 years to see a large Germany. Austrian President Schuschnigg, knowing he would receive no help from Italy and that France and Britain would not interfere in Hitler's plans, resigned, and 2 days later, German troops marched into Austria unopposed. Hitler had successfully annexed Austria, under the guise of national self-determination as justification. After the successful reoccupation of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia, of which 3 million people in the Sudetenland were of German origin. The Czech government hoped that Britain and France would come to its assistance in the event of a German invasion, but British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was intent on avoiding war. He made 2 trips to Germany in September and offered Hitler favourable agreements, but the Führer kept increasing his demands. On the 30th of September 1938, Hitler attended a meeting in Munich, accompanied by Britain, France and Italy, all of whom agreed that Hitler should have the Sudetenland, as long as he promised to go no further. The Soviets and the Czechs were not represented at the meeting, and realising that no country would come to their aid, Czechoslovakia were forced to surrender the Sudetenland to Germany. After the meeting, Chamberlain went to Hitler and asked him to sign a peace treaty between Great Britain and Germany, to which Hitler happily agreed. Upon his return to Britain, Chamberlain delivered his Peace in Our Time speech to cheering crowds. To people at the time, Neville Chamberlain was a great champion. The Munich Agreement had won the peace and war was averted. But from this, Hitler saw Europe as weak and unwilling to stand up to his demands. Winston Churchill, one of Chamberlain's greatest critics, said, "You were given the choice between war and dishonour. You chose dishonour and you will have war." Churchill was proven right when just half a year later, on the 15th of March 1939, German troops marched into Czechoslovakia. Once again, Hitler had broken an agreement. France and Britain then guaranteed Poland's safety, with Britain also beginning to rearm and install a highly secret radar system along its east coast. On August 23, 1939, the Germans and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, which sent shockwaves across the world's diplomatic community. The signing of this pact for Hitler ended the prospect of a two-front war, which allowed for a greater taking of Poland, but for Stalin this bought him time, to rebuild the Red Army that he had purged. As the last days of summer arrived, there was a sense in Europe that war was imminent, and the sense was right. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, revolutionized warfare, and allowed an attacker to destroy an opponent before they were even mobilized. Through the use of tanks or panzers, German forces were able to quickly smash border defences and circle enemy troops. They were to be supported by tactical air power, the Luftwaffe, that provided close aerial support to ground operations. Using this tactic, Germany was able to quickly knock out opponents, allowing them to conduct operations without the total mobilization of the economy and society, much like the First World War had required. The First World War was one of attrition, something Germany wasn't in the current position to win or endure. This new mode of warfare, therefore, was to be one of speed and efficiency. On September 1st, 1939, Germany, with 52 divisions and over 1 million men, made their way into Poland, attacking through the north and the south, destroying the Polish armed forces. Britain responded with an ultimatum to Germany to cease military operations. The ultimatum was ignored, and so France, Britain, Australia and New Zealand all declared war on Germany, with Neville Chamberlain broadcasting the announcement on radio. The German attack was led by 5 armoured divisions, containing 300 tanks apiece, followed by 4 motorised infantry divisions, carrying their artillery and equipment, with cover provided from the air by the Luftwaffe. Believing that the invasion would be stopped by British and French intervention, the Polish were slow to mobilise and poorly prepared to face the German onslaught. Upon mobilisation, the Poles sported 1.3 million men, however possessed outdated equipment and only a few tanks, with the German armoured and motorised divisions outnumbering the Polish 15-1. Equipment was so scarce and outdated for the Polish that cavalry squadrons were seen to be charging heavily armoured German tank divisions. The invasion had worked with greater speed and efficiency than planned, and by September 8th, Warsaw, the Polish capital, had been reached. Once Germany had broken Polish resistance, Stalin moved troops into Poland, being keen to regain territory that had once belonged to Russia before the 1917 revolution. Poland was now to fight a war on 2 fronts, something it couldn't win, and so on the 27th of September 1939, Polish commanders negotiated a ceasefire, with the last Polish military unit surrendering on October 6th. Altogether, Poland lost 70,000 troops against the German invaders, and another 50,000 against the USSR, with 133,000 being wounded. The Germans took over 700,000 Polish prisoners, and the Soviets another 300,000. 150,000 Poles managed to escape, many coming to Great Britain and enlisting in the armed forces. For Hitler, the invasion of Poland was his third successful annexation of a foreign country. He had got what he wanted, and the Western powers had once again done nothing. This period became known as the Phony War, because Britain and France took no military action despite declaring war on Germany. Blitzkrieg had been a major success, and over the course of the next few months, Hitler continuously said that he didn't want a war in the West.
Well, he always said he didn't want a war in the West, but he invaded France, again through Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality in June of 1940. The French army was overwhelmed by the German advance, and they were poorly organized at the time. French refugees fled to the south, and a lot of the British and French troops wanted to evacuate from France. They went to a place called Dunkirk. I do not suggest that movie. It's not that good. It's very boring, as a matter of fact. I like Kenneth Branagh, but the movie was just bad. Okay. June 18, 1939, the Germans reached Paris. I'm sorry, 1939. And I think that should be 1940. June 18, 1940, France surrendered. Germans occupied northern France. Southern France fell under the Vichy regime headed by Marshal Pétain. And then they had a Free French movement that left the country and was in exile in England at the time. After that, the Battle of Britain, let me correct that. That is supposed to be June 18th, 1940, okay? Not 1939. I think we need to fix that. Let's say here. 40, thank you very much. 1940, okay. And then the Battle of Britain began in July 1940 and went for a whole year to June 1941. There were 40,000 civilians dead. There was a stalemate in the air, but there was a stiff British resistance, and the Germans could never actually do anything because they were going to invade England, but they couldn't get in. They wanted to defeat them in the air. This is a map of the Second World War in Europe as it started. There was a phony war that occurred, that nothing was really going on after Britain and France declared war, but France was invaded, and they were just decimated. Northern France was occupied by the Germans, and southern France became Vichy France, because the government was set up at Vichy France. And their leader was General Henri Philippe Pétain, who was a general in World War I. I spoke about him when we talked about Verdun. Winston Churchill becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And he's talented, but he's arrogant. And his language and his personal diplomacy was not that good. He convinced FDR to break with American neutrality and go forth with what was known as the Lend-Lease Act. Now, the Lend-Lease Act was an act that the Americans engaged in where they lent ships and ammunition to the British, and in turn, the British gave the Americans naval bases, access to naval bases around the world. It became a global war, the Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans used what they called their submarines were called Unterseeboots, or undersea boats, and they were known as the Wolf Pack because they attacked in packs and sank millions of tons of merchant shipping. British development of sonar and aerial reconnaissance actually helped to defeat the German Navy, and they broke the German Enigma code. In North Africa, the British needed to protect the Suez. The British humiliation of Italian invasion force in Libya forced the Germans to intervene. The Germans had a special army force called the Afrika Korps, which was under the command of General Erwin Rommel. Rommel was seen as a military hero, but later he would be forced to commit suicide rather than face a trial for treason against the German people. The British defeated the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. Rommel's invasion of Egypt was defeated at El Alamein in 1942 by the British forces, and the United States landed in French territories in Algeria and Morocco. Now, how did the United States get into World War II? Well, basically what happened was Japan signed an agreement with Germany and Italy called the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo Axis, and they became a member of the Axis powers. And they had been had it against the United States since the Treaty of Versailles, because at the Treaty of Versailles, Woodrow Wilson stated the Japanese asked for a equality resolution within the Treaty of Versailles, and Woodrow Wilson turned them down, so the Japanese left. At the 1922 Washington Naval Conference, Japan was told what they could and what they could not build as far as a navy was concerned. And they had gotten a new emperor around 1925 by the name of Hirohito. And Hirohito appointed a guy by the name of Hideki Tojo as his prime minister, who was a militarist. And when Japan started having these invasions in 1931 and then Nanking in 1937, the United States had an oil embargo. Well, this cut off rubber and steel and gasoline and petrol and oil to the Japanese Empire, so they couldn't maintain an invasion or maintain a war. So the Japanese saw something else as an alternative, and this is what drew the United States into World War II.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor, America's mid-Pacific naval bastion. On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow. The Japs copied their German masters in striking hard at airfields. Hickam Field, northwest of Honolulu, and the Ford Island Naval Plane Base were the first objectives of Japan's treachery. Scores of planes were bruised and battered by the Japs' aerial bombs. Many of these were demolished beyond repair. Direct hits were scored on hangars, and these were badly shattered. Equipment and airplane supplies were reduced to smoldering ruins. Here at the Naval Air Station is grim and positive evidence of Jap treachery. Here foul blows were struck, while Jap diplomats were talking peace in Washington. America lost 3 destroyers. Here are seen the United States destroyers Downs and Shore as they rest on the bottom of Pearl Harbor with decks awash after Jap bombers make direct hits on their decks. First to feel the sting of Japanese steel are the USS Oklahoma and Utah, the latter a 33-year-old target ship. Accurate hits by the enemy bombers make short work of these 2 naval bulwarks. Now, with their keels practically out of water, they lie helpless wrecks and a sad reminder of cowardly strategy. To make possible a surprise attack within Pearl Harbor, the Japs built 2-man submarines to enable them to fire sneak blows within waters that are narrow and tortuous. Several of these surprise weapons were blown from the water by direct hits of our naval gunners. Others were beached and captured. While sky and sea fire was still raging, salvage crews inspected our naval craft to estimate what may be saved. Before the din of bursting bombs had been silenced, preparations were underway to salvage these 2 warships. At low tide, the huge propeller of the Oklahoma, stilled by the enemy, was high above water. It is believed that the small 2-man Jap submarines carrying dual torpedo tubes were responsible for these 2 losses to our Pacific fleet. here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes. These pictures were made by a fearless cameraman who thought nothing of his personal safety to make possible this record for all posterity. A single lucky hit was responsible for the disaster that befell the Arizona when a Jap bomb falling directly through one of the battleship's funnels exploded in the engine room and set ablaze tons of fuel oil. Dense black smoke billowed to the sky as the massive control tower began to keel over. The Arizona's courageous crew stuck to its guns until the very end. Here was displayed heroism that will live forever in the glorious annals and traditions of the American Navy. The once mighty Arizona now rests on Pearl Harbor's muddy bottom, a pitiful relic of its former self, a grim monument to the treachery of Japan. The once mighty dreadnought's armor plate is twisted and torn, but the great battleship's control tower still stands, a defiant beacon that in days to come will cast its shadow upon Nippon's very shores. At Pearl Harbor, at Hickam Field, in the bomb-pocked streets of Honolulu, ever is written history. History with a tragic, treacherous pen. History that 130 million Americans will never forget. And in days to come, the Japs, too, will remember Pearl Harbor. Here is a tragic, unforgettable page in the annals of America. Here the cunning deceit of the Japs will never be forgotten. Here they hoped to score a knockout before the war began. The Arizona's gun crews, battered and broken, fired to the last. Their guns pointed skyward, from whence the enemy appeared. The Jap sneak blow cost hundreds of military and civilian lives. The treacherous attack cost our Pacific Fleet 2 battleships outright, another capsized, the loss of 3 destroyers and a mine layer.
That the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. How long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
By the summer of 1941, Germany dominated the continent. The world was at war. It was truly a world war. His ultimate goal was to conquer Russia and the Ukraine, although in 1939 he made an agreement with the Russians, a non-aggression pact, but he wanted to eliminate communism. That was one of the things he wanted to eliminate. He believed that the Russians and the Ukrainians were ethnically inferior, and the Jews were governed by the communists. They were ruled by the communists. So Adolf Hitler wanted to see to it that it was just wanted to eliminate them. He invaded the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd, 1941. He invaded the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, Adolf Hitler didn't learn from his history. He didn't read it. Napoleon attacked Russia right before the winter time. Russian winters can be brutal, especially getting down to temperatures of 30 to 40 below for extended periods of time, like a week or 2 weeks or even a month. And Stalin purged, he'd gotten rid of Russia's most capable commanders because he was a dictator before the war, and he had them all shot and killed. So he had no real leaders, so he purged his army. The Germans took thousands of prisoners, and eventually the Russians would win. The war against the Soviets was characterized by ideology and racial hatred. They were cleansing occupied territories of undesirable elements. When the German army would go in, they had groups called Einsatzgruppen, and that basically stood for Special Action Squads. And they would go in and they would round up all the undesirables like Jews and Gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, trade unionists, and Russians, and would either march them off to a prisoner of war camp or they would shoot them, mostly shoot them. And that's what they mean by ethnic cleansing. Adolf Hitler promised Germany that he was going to eliminate all Jews. He called it European Jewry, is what it's called. Hitler diverted his attack from Moscow to the industrial south, which is where he made his mistake. The Nazi New Order was a patchwork affair, military governments in Poland and the Ukraine. There were collaborators in France, and allied fascists in Hungary. Now, these were all people working with the Nazis within their own countries. The empire was meant to feed Germany and maintain morale and support. Occupied country paid occupation costs and taxes, food, industrial production, and manpower. A lot of times they were moved to Germany to work slave labor. The puppet regimes were in Norway and the Netherlands. Dedicated party of Nazis governed, and at the same time there was a well-organized resistance movement. In France, collaboration ranged from simple survival tactics to active Nazi support, the isolation or deportation of French Jews. There were communist activists that had a long tradition of smuggling and resisting government. They became active guerrillas in guerrilla warfare and saboteurs that would blow things up behind enemy lines. And then there was the Free French and Charles de Gaulle. Now, de Gaulle was a veteran of World War I. He was wounded at the Battle of Verdun, and later, well, he was captured as a prisoner of war. Spent most of his time in a German prisoner of war camp. He couldn't stand them. But he left France, and he was the government in exile in London, and he ruled the Free French from there. Okay, very capable leader, although he was arrogant as well. In Yugoslavia, the fascist Croats were against the most Serbs. The Ustasha, Josip Broz, who was later known as Tito, emerged as the leader of the Yugoslav resistance. It was a communist guerrilla army, and it gained support of the Allies. There were moral issues facing the occupied countries. The enemies of the Nazis were considered undesirables, if you hadn't figured that out already. I'm going to stop here at part 1, and we'll pick this up again next Wednesday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.